Well, what role, speaking from our Orthodox perspective, Father John Whiteford, what role is Scripture supposed to play in our faith and in our worship?
Well, Scripture is, of course, central to the church and to our worship. That's something that's actually very striking to people who come and attend an Orthodox service for the first time, is how much Scripture they hear. Almost every word in our services come from the Scriptures in one way or another. And we're constantly hearing psalms, we're constantly hearing allusions to Scripture, and one of the most important parts of the liturgy is the reading of the appointed epistles and gospel readings. And, of course, there's a homily based on that. And just in terms of the symbolism of things, on the Holy Table, which is sort of the central focus of the church, right on that Holy Table we have the Gospel book, and we treat the Gospel book with great reverence, and we process around the church with that Gospel book, showing that it's the center of our faith. So Scripture is extremely important. It can't be taken out of that context of the worship and the tradition of our church.
But in terms of the practice of the Christian life, what you're arguing and proposing is that the Bible is not all-sufficient, separated from the great tradition of the Holy Fathers.
That's right. I mean, Protestants talk about how they affirm the all-sufficiency of Scripture, that Scripture is all that we need. But as a matter of fact, you don't find Protestants just handing out Bibles to people, and they don't just read from the Bible in their services. They feel a need to explain it.
Clearly.
And study Bibles is a booming industry because people want something to explain to them what the Scriptures mean. I mean, in the book of Acts, we have the Ethiopian eunuch, very well-educated man who was able to read in Hebrew, and he was reading the prophecy of Isaiah, but St. Philip came alongside, and he said, "Do you understand what you're reading?" And he said, "No, how can I unless someone explain it to me?" Right. And he explained it to him. And so we can be educated, we can read the Scripture, but we have to have someone who knows this whole context, who knows the author, who knows the church is the co-author of the Scriptures, that can explain to us what these things mean.
Well, speaking then about our holy tradition, because this is a great segue you just handed me there, Father, thank you. Why is holy tradition a better way to understand the Scriptures than by the private interpretive approach that we've been discussing?
There's a Protestant author, as a matter of fact, who used an illustration that I think is a very good one about this very question. And he was a lawyer, so that's the reason why he used it. But there's a principle in law that's called the course of performance. And if your great-grandfather, for example, had owned a company, and my great-grandfather had owned a company, and we had a contract between our two companies, and you and I had both inherited those companies, and then you came along and you pointed to some obscure clause in that contract, and you said, well, you know, this clause says that you're supposed to do X, Y, Z, but that was something that had never been done. No one had ever read it that way. The legal approach to that would be to ask, well, how has this contract, in fact, actually been implemented? How has it been understood over time?
How interesting.
Is there any evidence that anyone has ever read it that way?
How interesting.
And as a matter of fact, if there isn't, then that argument is found to be baseless. And so when you come to Scripture, you can't just find some text and come up with some interpretation that no one has ever thought of before and have a plausible argument that it's true. There's a saying that I like to quote, all that's old might not be gold, but if it's new, it can't be true. And when it comes to Scripture, that's certainly true. If you read Scripture and you find something that after 2,000 years no one has ever thought of until you came along, you know it's wrong.
There's probably a reason. And two, let's just talk a little bit about how the canon came about. Holy tradition was not passed down. You know, you didn't go to your bookstore and buy the fully canonical leather-bound Bible, did you?
That's right. There's a tradition about what books should be in the Bible. For example, the apostles, St. Paul, wrote epistles to various churches, and those epistles were collected in various places, and certain regions were more familiar with certain texts than others. But as time went on and various local churches compared notes, they developed a understanding of which books were authoritative from the apostles and should be considered to be part of Scripture. And they compiled the canon of Scripture not because they were trying to say, here's everything we need to know. They actually compiled the canon because you had heretics that were coming up with pseudepigraphal books that were not written by an apostle, but they were claiming that they were. You also had a heretic by the name of Marcion that was kicking books out and saying that they weren't legitimate, and he was even rewriting some of the books that he accepted. And so he was coming up with a canon of Scripture that was opposed to the tradition of the church. So the church had to make a statement. These are the books that actually come from the apostles. However, they understood that those books didn't address every question that the church might need to ask. And St. Paul, when you read his epistles, it's very obvious that his epistles were in response to particular problems in those churches, that he wasn't writing a systematic theology or a comprehensive catechism of the church. If the church in Corinth had a problem with certain kinds of behavior, he would address that question. Another church had a different problem, he addressed that. But if it wasn't a problem, he didn't address it. So, for example, he doesn't talk about how do you enter church. What kind of prayers do you say when you're in church?
Right.
How does the liturgy perform? Because those things were not matters of controversy. Nobody was arguing about it, so he wasn't wasting his ink trying to persuade people to believe things that everybody believed. And so the church has not only told us what's in the Scripture, it's also handed that Scripture on down to us, and it's part of a much wider tradition of apostolic instruction. Up until the time of the ending of the persecutions of the church, catechisms were secret. And you still find this, for example, in St. Cyril of Jerusalem's catechism, even though it was, in fact, written down at the very beginning of St. Cyril's catechetical lectures. He says, don't write what I'm about to say down. If somebody didn't pay attention to what he had to say, and he was at the end of that persecution period, and so people were less cautious. But that's actually the earliest catechism we have. But we know that the church was catechizing people for those previous centuries. It's just that those things were not written down because the epistles contain the things that the church wanted everybody to know. They were read aloud in church. The Gospels are the proclamation of the good news of Jesus Christ. But the things that the church taught to its own members that were matters for its own concern, I mean, they didn't go around teaching pagans how the liturgy was performed because that wasn't something that they needed to know, and they didn't want people who didn't respect those things to mock them. But those things were certainly taught inside the church, and they were preserved and handed down.
Father John, can you give us maybe an example or two of how you would use Holy Tradition to shed light on the Scriptures?
Well, one of the things that amazed me after becoming Orthodox was how many things in Scripture I found that I never really realized were there. When you read in the Gospel of John where Christ says, whose sins ye remit, they're remitted, and whose sins ye retain, they are retained, I read that I don't know how many times and never really thought about its meaning. But in an Orthodox context, that clearly fits within the context of our understanding of confession. And so that's a place where actually I use Scripture to explain the tradition, I suppose, so it's kind of at the inverse of what you're asking. But when I talk to people about confession, I very often have people object, well, why do I need to confess to a priest? How can a priest forgive my sins? And yet here's something that the Scriptures say Christ delegated to his apostles, and through his apostles to, we understand by tradition, to their successors and priests or deputies, you might say, of the bishops. And so it makes perfect sense in the light of tradition. And when you understand that in the light of tradition, you see what Christ is talking about. Whereas as a Protestant, I think I just kind of crinkled my brow when I read that and didn't really know what it meant.
Yeah, you could certainly make a case, too, that John 6 speaks fairly clearly to support the Eucharistic and sacramental Eucharistic tradition.
That's certainly true. And, of course, when you start talking about the tradition of the church, another area, and this is something that most Protestants would agree with us on, and that's when you start talking about the deity of Christ and the Trinity. Jehovah's Witnesses, they read the Bible, and they come away saying that Christ wasn't God. We read the Bible, and we understand that Christ is God. Well, you can make arguments back and forth about what the Scriptures are actually saying, but when you're talking about what has the church always understood about these, it's very clear. And as a matter of fact, the Jehovah's Witnesses years ago put out a pamphlet on, where they were trying to dispute the doctrine of the Trinity, and they were trying to appeal to the fathers of the church to support the idea that the Trinity wasn't taught. But the very fathers that they appealed to, in fact, did teach the doctrine of the Trinity, and I was able to show that to them and just make the case to them. How could what you believe be true when you can't point to people who agree with you?
Yeah, you really get into trouble when you wrench the Scriptures from both tradition and history, don't you?
That's right. The Baptists, there's a sort of a folk history among very conservative Baptists that there have always been true believers like them. And they point to people like the Waldensians, and sometimes they even point to heretical groups in the early church that didn't believe in the Trinity as sort of the forebearers of the Baptist church. But as a matter of fact, if you actually do serious historical study, you cannot find anybody who believed like the Southern Baptists did for the first 1,500 years of church history. It's just a fact. You might find one group that kind of agreed with them on one point or another, but you're just not going to find the Southern Baptist Convention in Asia Minor in the 8th century. It didn't exist. There was no such church.
Well, why has holy tradition gotten such a bad rap?
Well, I think for Protestants particularly, it's mostly in reaction to the Roman Catholic Church.
Right.
And just sort of generally speaking, when you talk about tradition, people tend to think of it as being legalistic. They point to the things that Christ said about the Pharisees in the Gospels, where these Pharisees focused on the rituals or observing the customs that they had passed on, but they really ignored the substance of the Scriptures. But there's a lot more to tradition than the Roman Catholic Church, and when I started studying church history and finally got past the point where I was viewing everything that seemed contrary to Protestantism as if it was somehow either Roman Catholicism or it was Protestantism. In other words, if I saw anything that smacked of, say, bishops or liturgy, I assumed that that was sort of the early form of the Roman Catholic Church, and that couldn't be right because they're the ones that worship the Virgin Mary and believe in the Pope and believe in purgatory, so anything like that couldn't be true. And they see in Scripture the Pharisees and the negative cases in Scripture where traditions talked about the traditions of men as opposed to the traditions taught by the apostles that come from Christ. And they see people who are focused on maintaining customs and observing rituals but are ignoring the real substance, the heart and soul of Scripture. And they, sort of the folk history that I alluded to earlier, is that they believe that, you had this pure guitar strumming early church that was like them, but that somehow at the time of Constantine it all went to hell and disappeared. And those are the reasons why you encounter that sort of a reaction. When you start actually digging into church history, you realize that those things that the Protestants are reacting to were actually things that came very late. And that's what you have to do to open up a Protestant's mind, is to try to get them to stop assuming that all these things are Roman Catholic and to start trying to just take it on its own value. And for me, what really opened my mind up on this question was when I began reading the epistles of St. Ignatius of Antioch, who was a disciple of St. John the Apostle, and I figured I couldn't dismiss him. It's pretty hard to say that he's somehow a late accretion who was corrupted by Constantine. And here he was talking about how no group that didn't have bishops, priests, and deacons could even be called a church.
Right.
He talks about the Eucharist being the body and blood of Christ,
right,
and that the heretics abstain from Eucharist because they don't believe that. There are a number of things that I read in his epistles that just didn't jibe with the Protestantism that I had been taught. And when I read those epistles, I knew I couldn't stay a Protestant. I wasn't sure what I was going to become yet, but I knew I couldn't stay a Protestant.
Father, what's interesting, too, when I was doing some research on this interview, I was looking through J.N.D. Kelly's Early Christian Doctrine, and he says the following, quote, "There is no reason to infer that the primitive church regarded the apostolic testimony as confined to written documents emanating from or attributed to the apostles," unquote. So right to your point, I think.
Well, they very clearly didn't, because at the time of the early church, they didn't have a New Testament. They might have had an epistle or two here or there, but they certainly didn't have a body of the New Testament to appeal to. So scriptures that they appealed to were mostly the Old Testament.
Exactly.